The 13th time my son drove his finger into my chest. He leaned close enough for me to smell bourbon on his breath and said, "You're nothing without my money, Dad." Behind him, nearly 40 people stood around the 4th of July barbecue, pretending not to stare. My daughter-in-law Amberly wasn't pretending. She had her phone pointed directly at me, recording while she laughed. I was 65 years old, and Sterling was humiliating me in front of neighbors, friends, and family because I had refused to sign one document giving him access to money he desperately needed to rescue his collapsing cryptocurrency project. "Sign it," he said again. I looked at the paper, then at him. "No." His face hardened. "You useless old parasite." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch him. I simply folded the document and placed it back in his hand. Then I looked around at the house. The swimming pool, the landscaped yard, and the expensive party where my son had just called me worthless. Sterling thought all of it belonged to him. He had no idea I owned the land beneath his feet. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to Calm Dad Stories and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes the person calling you worthless is standing on everything you quietly gave them. My name is Garrick Hale. For most of my life, I built everything slowly, one contract, one investment, one careful decision at a time. Sterling had never respected that kind of patience. He wanted success immediately, and lately he'd convinced himself cryptocurrency was going to give it to him. His latest project was collapsing, and the document in his hand was supposed to save it. All he needed was my signature. The first time I refused, Sterling called me selfish, then ungrateful. Then he started jabbing his finger into my chest. By the 7th jab, conversations around us had stopped. By the 10th, Amberly was laughing openly. "Keep going," she said behind her phone. This is priceless. I looked at my son and wondered when helping him had turned into teaching him that I could be treated this way. 5 years earlier, when Sterling couldn't qualify for the home he wanted, I'd quietly solved the problem. He knew I'd helped. What he didn't understand was exactly how much control I'd retained. "Get out of my house," he finally said. That almost made me smile. "Your house? You heard me." Amberly lowered her phone. "Maybe next time you'll remember who actually needs who." I nodded once. "Maybe I will." Sterling turned back toward his guests, as though he'd won. Amberly began replaying the video she'd recorded. Neither of them noticed anything unusual when I walked through the side gate and drove away. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten them. I didn't tell Sterling the truth about the property. Anger would only warn him. Instead, I drove home and entered the small office where I'd kept 30 years of financial records. From a locked cabinet, I removed one folder and placed it on my desk. Inside was the original deed to Sterling's house. I read it once, even though I already knew one. 57 a.m. I need you to sell a property. Fast. I need you to sell a property. Fast. There was silence on the other end of the phone. My associate, Warren Cole, had handled several property transactions for me over the years, but I'd never called him at 2 a.m. "Which property?" he asked. "The house on Briarwood." Another pause. "Sterling's house?" "My house," I corrected. "The one Sterling lives in." After we hung up, I didn't go to bed. I opened the financial records I'd avoided looking at too closely for years. And for the first time, I saw my son's lifestyle for what it really was. Sterling loved presenting himself as a self-made businessman. His social media showed the 4-bedroom house, the swimming pool, expensive dinners, tailored suits, and Amberly posing beside a luxury SUV. What nobody saw was the structure underneath it. 5 years earlier, Sterling's credit had been too damaged for a conventional mortgage, so I'd purchased the property in cash through my LLC and allowed them to live there. When he promised it was temporary, I believed him. Then temporary became normal. Property taxes came from my account. Homeowner's insurance came from my account. When Sterling fell behind on other expenses, I quietly covered those too. I kept telling myself I was giving my son time to become stable. Instead, I had made instability comfortable. The numbers on my screen were embarrassing not because I couldn't afford them, but because of what they revealed about me. Every time Sterling made a reckless decision, I had removed the consequence before it reached him. Amberly drove a vehicle registered through my financial arrangements. Their premium phone plan was linked to me. Several household services were automatically charged to accounts I controlled. Even while Sterling called me a parasite, part of the lifestyle he used to prove his superiority was still being financed by the man he was insulting. Then I pulled his most recent financial information. His credit was worse than I'd realized. His crypto project had consumed nearly everything he could access, and conventional lenders wanted nothing to do with him. Suddenly, the desperation at the barbecue made sense. He hadn't wanted my signature because he saw an opportunity. He needed it because other doors were already closing. I leaned back and thought about the document he'd pushed against my chest. If I'd signed it, I wouldn't have been helping my son recover. I would have been feeding the same machine that had taught him somebody else would always absorb his mistakes. At 6:40 that morning, Warren called back. I reviewed the LLC documents. You can sell. Sterling has no ownership interest. How quickly? Normally? Weeks. I don't want normally. Garrick, rushing means accepting less money. How much less? He gave me a range that would have bothered me the day before. Now it didn't. Find a buyer who can close immediately. You're serious. I looked at the bruise beginning to darken beneath my shirt. Completely. After the call, I opened the banking dashboard containing the automatic payments connected to Sterling's household. My cursor rested over the first account. For years, one click from me could have stopped the support. I'd never made it because I kept hoping gratitude would arrive before consequences had to. Yesterday answered that question. I wasn't going to destroy Sterling's life. I wasn't going to take anything he'd earned. I was simply going to stop paying for what he hadn't. And once I did, I suspected my son's definition of my money was about to become painfully clear. My son's definition of my money was about to become painfully clear. At 8 the next morning, I was sitting across from Warren Cole with the deed, LLC records, and a purchase agreement spread between us. He had already found an asset company willing to move immediately, but there was a price for speed. They're offering 40% below market value, Warren said. If you give me 30 days, I can do much better. I don't want 30 days. Then you're leaving a lot of money on the table. I thought about Sterling ordering me out of a house he'd never purchased. Consider it the price of clarity. Warren studied me for a moment, then turned the contract around. The buyer would complete the transaction within 48 hours and take possession immediately afterward. I signed every required page. Warren gathered the papers. Once this closes, Sterling can't stay there. I understand. Does he know you're selling? No. When are you going to tell him? I stood and buttoned my jacket. I'm not. By noon, the sale was moving through expedited processing, but the house was only one part of the illusion I'd created for Sterling. Back in my office, I opened the account I'd used for years to quietly support his family. I started with Amberley's SUV. The payment arrangement was tied to me. I stopped it. Next came the premium family phone plan. Sterling and Amberley had upgraded their devices repeatedly without once asking who was still paying the monthly bill. I removed their lines. Then the household subscriptions, premium grocery delivery, specialty food services, club memberships, and several smaller charges I'd barely noticed anymore. One by one, I ended my participation. I didn't touch Sterling's personal bank account. I didn't take his wages. I didn't cancel anything he had purchased and paid for himself. I simply separated my money from his life. That distinction mattered to me. This wasn't about stealing from my son. It was about finally making him carry what belonged to him. Then one charge caught my attention. The high-speed mobile data plan attached to Amberley's phone. I opened the usage history and almost laughed. She had spent the previous night uploading clips from the 4th of July barbecue, the same footage she'd recorded while Sterling jabbed me in the chest and called me a parasite. She was using a phone plan I paid for to publish my humiliation. I stared at the screen for several seconds, then clicked Remove Line. Confirmation appeared immediately. For the first time in years, there was nothing left for me to fix before Sterling noticed a problem. No emergency transfer waiting, no quiet payment. No father standing behind the curtain, keeping the scenery upright. At 4:18 that afternoon, Warren called. Buyer signed. Closing is scheduled tomorrow. Good. Garrick, I need to ask you once more. Are you certain? I looked through my office window at the evening light. For years I thought protecting Sterling from failure would help him become stronger. All it did was convince him failure belonged to somebody else. Warren didn't argue. Then tomorrow it is. I hung up and closed the laptop. Somewhere across town, Sterling was preparing for an important lunch with two investors he believed could rescue his crypto project. He would wear one of his expensive suits, order from the top of the menu, and present himself as a man whose success was beyond question. He had no idea the financial scaffolding behind that image had already been removed, and by the time the waiter placed the bill in front of him, Sterling was going to discover exactly how much of his wealthy life had never belonged to him at all. Sterling was going to discover exactly how much of his wealthy life had never belonged to him at all. The next afternoon, he walked into one of downtown's most expensive steakhouses, wearing a charcoal designer suit and the confidence of a man convinced he was hours away from saving his company. Two investors were waiting at a private table. Between them, they controlled enough capital to keep Sterling's cryptocurrency project alive, and he intended to make sure they saw success before they saw desperation. He ordered premium steaks, expensive wine, and spoke for nearly 2 hours about growth projections, new investors, and the next phase of his company. He never mentioned that lenders had already rejected him. He never mentioned the money he'd tried to get from me on the 4th of July. From the outside, Sterling still looked exactly like the businessman he had spent years pretending to be. By dessert, both investors seemed interested. One finally said, "Send us the revised numbers Monday. If they make sense, we'll talk terms." Sterling smiled. "You'll have them." Then the waiter brought the bill. Sterling barely glanced at the total before handing over his black card. A minute later, the waiter returned. "I'm sorry, sir. It was declined." Sterling laughed. "Run it again." The waiter did. Declined. The investors stopped talking. Sterling pulled out another card. "Try this one." Another electronic beep. Another rejection. His smile disappeared. "Your machine must be having problems." "It's processing other cards normally, sir." Sterling reached for his phone to open his banking app. The screen showed no service. He tried again, then looked around, as if the restaurant itself had betrayed him. I wasn't there. But Warren later told me, one of the investors described the change in Sterling's face perfectly. Confidence turned into panic in less than 30 seconds. "Gentlemen, give me a minute," Sterling said. One investor pushed his chair back. "If your liquidity is this unstable, we have bigger concerns than lunch. This has nothing to do with my company. Then, pay the bill." Sterling couldn't. The two men exchanged a look, stood, and left without discussing Monday's meeting again. Sterling remained at the table with a bill he had ordered to impress people who now wanted nothing to do with him. He emptied the cash in his wallet, but it wasn't enough. In the end, he had to leave his expensive wristwatch with the restaurant manager as temporary collateral while he arranged the remaining payment. By the time he stepped onto the sidewalk, the investor meeting he'd believed would save his company was effectively dead. He tried calling Amberly again. No service. He borrowed a stranger's phone, but she didn't answer. What Sterling didn't know was that several miles away, Amberly was discovering the same thing he had just learned. The cards she treated as her own no longer worked, and the luxury surrounding them had always depended on somebody else's money. But their declined cards were about to become the smallest problem they had. Because while Sterling stood outside that restaurant without his watch, without his investors, and without a working phone, the 48-hour sale of the house had just closed. The 48-hour sale of the house had just closed. Sterling didn't know it yet, and neither did Amberly. While he was losing his investors downtown, she was finishing an expensive treatment at a luxury spa across the city. According to what I learned later, she walked to the counter, handed over her card, and barely looked up from her phone. The receptionist ran it once, declined. Amberly frowned. Try again. The second attempt produced the same result. She handed over another card. That one failed too. "Your machine is broken," she snapped. The receptionist calmly told her other payments were processing normally. Amberly reached for her phone, probably expecting to transfer money or call Sterling. No service. That was when embarrassment turned into panic. She demanded a manager, raised her voice, and accused the staff of humiliating her. But shouting couldn't create money. With no working card and no way to reach Sterling, Amberly eventually removed the diamond bracelet from her wrist and left it with the manager until the bill could be settled. Less than an hour later, she was heading home furious. Sterling arrived shortly afterward, exhausted, without his watch, and still trying to understand why every financial door had closed at once. But when they reached Briarwood, both of them stopped at the gate. A thick, black chain had been wrapped through it. Beyond the fence sat an industrial dumpster. 3 private security guards stood near the entrance. Sterling rushed forward. "What the hell is this?" One guard stepped between him and the gate. "This property changed ownership this morning." Sterling actually laughed. "No, it didn't. This is my house." The guard held out the transfer documents. Sterling grabbed them, scanned the first page, then froze when he reached the ownership section. The seller wasn't him. It was the LLC I'd controlled from the beginning. "Where's my father?" he demanded. "I don't know, sir. He can't sell my house. According to these documents, it wasn't your house to sell." Amberly snatched the papers from him. For once, she had nothing clever to say. The guards had instructions from the new owner to allow them a short, supervised period to collect essential belongings. 15 minutes. Sterling exploded. "I've lived here 5 years. Then I suggest you use the 15 minutes. The gate opened. Sterling and Amberly ran inside. There was no graceful packing, no careful selection of the luxury items they'd spent years displaying. Clothes went into suitcases until the suitcases were full. Then shoes, cosmetics, documents, and whatever else they could carry were stuffed into black contractor bags. When the 15 minutes ended, the guards escorted them back outside. Sterling stood beside a pile of luggage and garbage bags staring at the house he'd once ordered me to leave. The pool was still behind him. The landscaped yard was still perfect. The difference was that now he finally understood none of it had ever been his. He borrowed a guard's phone and called me. I answered on the 4th ring. "Dad, what did you do?" "I stopped paying for your life." "You sold my house." "No, Sterling. I sold mine." He went silent. Then Amberly started shouting somewhere behind him. Sterling lowered his voice. "Where are we supposed to go?" I remembered the 4th of July. "Get out of my house." "You're 40 years old," I said. "You'll figure it out." Then I ended the call. I thought losing the house might finally force Sterling to understand what his arrogance had cost him. I was wrong. Because as he stood outside that gate with everything he could carry, a black pickup pulled to the curb. Several men stepped out. Amberly saw them first. According to Sterling, all the anger disappeared from her face. She went completely pale. One of the men walked toward them, carrying a folder, and dropped it onto the hood of the truck. Sterling looked down at the first page. $80,000. Then he looked at his wife. "Amberly, what is this?" And for the first time that day, Sterling discovered a financial disaster that had nothing to do with me. Sterling discovered a financial disaster that had nothing to do with me. The man beside the black pickup tapped the document with one finger. $80,000. Past due. Sterling stared at him, then at Amberly. "Tell me he's lying." Amberly said nothing. That silence answered him. Months earlier, while Sterling was pouring everything he had into his failing crypto project, Amberly had borrowed money privately to maintain the lifestyle they displayed online. Designer handbags, jewelry, restaurants, weekend trips. The image of success had become so important to her that she had borrowed $80,000 simply to keep pretending it was real. "You borrowed 80 grand without telling me?" Sterling demanded. "I was going to pay it back." "With what?" The collector cut between them. "Your marriage isn't my problem. The balance is." Sterling tried explaining that they'd just lost access to the house and needed time. The man didn't care. He knew Sterling worked for a financial investment company downtown, and he wanted payment immediately. What happened next reached me through Sterling's attorney weeks later. The collectors followed him to the glass office building where he worked. Sterling entered through the lobby, hoping to keep the situation quiet. Instead, the men followed him inside and demanded their money loudly enough for employees across the floor to hear. Within minutes, everyone who knew Sterling as the polished businessman in expensive suits was watching him argue over an unpaid private debt. His supervisor came out of a conference room and demanded an explanation. Sterling tried blaming Amberly. Then he tried blaming me for suddenly cutting him off. Neither explanation helped. His employer heard only one thing clearly. Sterling's personal financial crisis had followed him directly into the workplace and disrupted the company in front of employees and clients. He was ordered upstairs. 20 minutes later, he returned, carrying a cardboard box. He had been fired. By sunset, Sterling had lost the investors who might have saved his project. The house he'd claimed was his, the financial support he'd taken for granted, and now his job. Amberly's $80,000 debt was still waiting. That evening, Daniel Price, an old friend who still worked near Sterling's office, called me. "Garrick, your son is in bad shape." "Is he hurt?" "No, angry. He's telling everyone you destroyed his life." I looked at the bruise, still visible on my chest. I didn't borrow $80,000. I didn't destroy his credit. And I didn't build his crypto company. I know. I'm just telling you what he's saying. After we hung up, I wondered whether I should call Sterling. A part of me still wanted to hear my son say he'd finally understood, but that call never came. Instead, Sterling spent the next 2 days searching for money. Banks rejected him. Investors stopped returning his calls. People who had happily attended his parties suddenly became difficult to reach. For the first time in years, there was no father quietly standing behind him with a checkbook. Then Sterling remembered something from his childhood. I owned a small cabin outside town, where I'd kept business records and emergency cash years earlier. He also remembered the wall safe in my office, and worse, he remembered the old combination. Sterling convinced himself there was still enough money inside to solve everything. He didn't call me to ask for help. He didn't apologize. He decided the money should already belong to him. Late that night, one of the exterior cameras at my cabin sent a motion alert to my phone. I opened the live feed. A figure dressed in black was moving along the rear fence. Even before he stepped beneath the porch light, I recognized the way he walked. It was my son. Then the camera caught something metallic in his hand. Sterling hadn't come to talk. He had come prepared to break into my house, and tucked inside his jacket was something that told me exactly how far desperation had pushed him. A set of brass knuckles. A set of brass knuckles. The moment I saw the metal flash beneath Sterling's jacket, whatever hope I still had that my son had come to talk disappeared. I was watching the security feed from my apartment, nearly 20 miles away. Sterling didn't know that I'd upgraded the cabin cameras the previous year after several burglaries in the area. Every entrance was covered, every recording was backed up automatically, and motion alerts came directly to my phone. I could have called him. I could have warned him that I was watching. Instead, I saved the first clip and contacted the sheriff's office. "Someone is attempting to enter my cabin," I told the dispatcher. "I have live security footage." She asked whether I knew the person. I looked at my son's face beneath the porch light. Yes, it's my son. Saying those words hurt more than I expected. On the screen, Sterling moved around the back of the cabin and tested a window. Locked. Then he approached the rear door and pulled a small pry bar from his jacket. This wasn't a desperate son coming to ask his father for help. He had planned the break-in. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way and instructed me not to approach the property. I stayed on the line and watched. Sterling forced the latch until the door opened. He disappeared inside. The interior camera picked him up seconds later. He moved quickly through the dark hallway with a flashlight, ignoring everything except the office. That told me exactly what he wanted. Years earlier, when Sterling was still a teenager, he'd seen me place emergency cash inside the wall safe. I hadn't stored money there in a long time, but Sterling apparently remembered both the safe and the old combination. He entered my office and went directly to it. No hesitation, no searching. He knew where it was. His hands moved across the keypad. Once, wrong code. Then again, the lock clicked. Sterling pulled the door open. He expected cash. Instead, the safe was empty, except for one white sheet of paper I'd placed there after selling the Briarwood property. Sterling picked it up and aimed his flashlight at the sentence I'd written across the center. "I am watching you." He froze. Then he looked toward the ceiling. His eyes found the camera. For several seconds, neither of us moved, even though 20 miles separated us. I could see the realization spreading across his face. Everything had been recorded. The pry bar, the forced door, the safe, and the brass knuckles, still visible beneath his jacket. Sterling dropped the paper and rushed toward the hallway. Too late. Through the exterior camera, red and blue light suddenly washed across the trees. Sterling stopped before reaching the back door. A voice outside ordered him to remain inside and keep his hands visible. He looked toward the window, then toward the front entrance, searching for another way out. There wasn't one that didn't lead directly past a camera or an officer. I closed my eyes for a moment. I hadn't wanted this ending for my son. I'd wanted him to lose the illusion that my money belonged to him. I'd wanted consequences to teach him what my protection never had. But Sterling had made one more choice, and this time the consequence wasn't mine to control. When I looked back at the screen, he slowly raised both hands. The brass knuckles fell from his jacket and struck the wooden floor. Officers entered seconds later. Sterling was pushed against the wall, searched, handcuffed, and led outside beneath the flashing lights. Before they placed him in the patrol car, he turned toward the cabin camera and stared directly into it. I couldn't hear what he said. I didn't need to. For the first time in his life, there was no payment I could make, no phone call I could place, and no problem I could quietly remove for him. Sterling had finally reached a consequence his father couldn't and wouldn't pay to erase. Sterling had finally reached a consequence his father couldn't and wouldn't pay to erase. By sunrise, he was sitting in county lockup, while I sat across from a detective, watching the cabin footage frame by frame. There was nothing ambiguous about what the cameras had captured. Sterling approaching through the rear of the property after dark, the pry bar in his hand, the forced door, his flashlight sweeping across the hallway, his direct path to my office. Then the moment he opened the safe and found my message waiting inside. But the detective stopped the video at one particular frame. Sterling had turned sideways just before entering the office, and the camera had caught the metal tucked beneath his jacket. "Those are brass knuckles?" he asked. That's what they looked like on the live feed. An evidence officer had already recovered them from the cabin floor. That changed the situation considerably. This wasn't simply a family argument that ended with a damaged door. My son had entered private property at night carrying something capable of seriously hurting another person. "Did he know you weren't there?" the detective asked. "I don't know." "Did he have permission to enter?" "No." "Permission to open the safe?" "No." I hated every answer, but I wasn't going to lie to protect Sterling again. That was how we'd reached this point in the first place. Later that morning, his attorney called me. "Mr. Hale, Sterling is asking whether you'll tell investigators this was a misunderstanding." I looked down at the bruise on my chest. Was the pry bar a misunderstanding? Silence. Was breaking my door a misunderstanding? He's under enormous financial pressure. Pressure explains choices. It doesn't erase them. The attorney tried another angle. Sterling had once known the safe combination. He had lived around my properties as a young man. Perhaps he believed he still had permission to enter. "Then watch the footage," I said. "People who think they're welcome usually use the front door." I ended the call. That afternoon, investigators asked me for anything documenting the deterioration between Sterling and me. I gave them the property records, messages surrounding the 4th of July argument, and then remembered Amberly's video. She had uploaded part of it publicly before I disconnected the phone plan. I had saved a copy. The detective watched Sterling jab his finger repeatedly into my chest while demanding my signature. He heard my son call me a parasite. He heard Amberly laughing behind the camera. When the video ended, he asked, "How long before the break-in was this?" "Less than a week," he wrote something in his notes. Suddenly, the two events were no longer isolated. First, Sterling had pressured me for money. Then he'd humiliated me when I refused. After losing access to my financial support, he'd entered my cabin at night and gone directly to a safe he believed contained cash. The evidence was beginning to tell the story without me having to tell it for him. Over the following weeks, Sterling's attorney tried to reduce the damage, but there was no way to erase the cloud recordings. No way to explain away the forced entry. No way to make the brass knuckles disappear. And no way to pretend Sterling hadn't known exactly where he was going once he entered the cabin. The prosecutor eventually told me the case would move forward. "You understand you may have to testify?" she asked. "Yes. Against your own son?" I stared at the paused image on her monitor. Sterling stood in my office holding the sheet that read, "I am watching you." "I'm not testifying against my son," I said quietly. "I'm testifying about what he chose to do." Months later, when I walked into the county courthouse, I saw Sterling for the first time since his arrest. No designer suit, no expensive watch, no crowd laughing behind him. He stood beside his attorney and avoided my eyes. Then the prosecutor rolled a large screen toward the jury. The first image wasn't the cabin. It was the 4th of July barbecue. Amberly's own recording filled the courtroom. And once again, in front of a room full of strangers, my son raised his hand, pointed his finger at my chest, and began counting himself toward the consequence waiting for him. My son raised his hand, pointed his finger at my chest, and began counting himself toward the consequence waiting for him. The courtroom was silent as Amberly's 4th of July video played across the large screen. One jab, then another. Sterling's voice echoed through the room. "You selfish old man." Another jab, Parasite. I didn't watch the screen. I watched Sterling. He sat beside his attorney, with his shoulders lowered, staring at the table, while 40 seconds of arrogance returned to him, one frame at a time. Then came the 13th jab, and the sentence I remembered better than the pain itself. "You're nothing without my money, Dad." Amberly's laughter followed. The prosecutor froze the image. "Mr. Hale, what did your son want you to do?" "Sign over financial rights he believed would help rescue his cryptocurrency project." "Did you agree?" "No." "What happened afterward?" "He told me to get out of the house." "Who owned that house?" I looked toward Sterling. "An LLC I controlled." The prosecutor then moved to the cabin footage. The jury watched Sterling approach after dark, force the rear door with a pry bar, and walk directly to my office. They watched him open the safe. They saw the note, "I am watching you." Then came the frame that mattered most, the metallic shape beneath his jacket. The prosecutor held up the brass knuckles recovered by police. Sterling's attorney argued that financial desperation had impaired his judgment, and that Sterling never actually struck anyone with them. The prosecutor didn't argue about what might have happened. She stayed with what could be proved. Sterling entered without permission, forced a locked door, went directly to a safe he believed contained cash, and carried brass knuckles while doing it. I wasn't asked to speculate about my son's intentions. I only had to tell the truth. Sterling had wanted money. I refused. Days later, he broke into my property looking for it. Amberly's situation unfolded separately. Investigators had begun examining financial records surrounding the $80,000 private debt and inconsistencies connected to how the money had been obtained and represented. The woman who had laughed while recording my humiliation was now facing her own legal problems. Months of hearings eventually came down to one morning. Sterling stood before the judge without the designer suit he'd worn on the 4th of July. The judge spoke about the forced entry, the weapon recovered at the scene, and the evidence showing a financial motive. Then the sentence came, 7 years in state prison. Sterling closed his eyes. I felt no satisfaction. This was still the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager whose first car I'd helped repair, the man I'd spent years rescuing from his own mistakes. But loving someone doesn't require lying about what they've become. As deputies approached him, Sterling finally looked at me. "Dad." It was the first time I'd heard his voice directed at me since the arrest. "Please." For most of his life, that word had worked. "Please cover this bill. Please help with the house. Please give me one more chance." Every rescue had postponed the lesson until the price became unbearable. I held his gaze, but didn't move. The deputies led him away. Outside the courtroom, I expected anger. Instead, I felt tired. The legal fight was ending, but one decision remained entirely mine. Sterling had spent years believing my lifetime of work would eventually become his inheritance. He had been wrong about the house. He had been wrong about my money. And before I left the city, I was going to make certain he could never make that mistake again. Before I left the city, I was going to make certain Sterling could never make that mistake again. 3 weeks after sentencing, I sat across from my attorney with one final set of documents between us. For decades, I'd assumed everything I built would eventually pass to my son. Businesses, investments, property, savings, the rewards of a lifetime spent working when other people were sleeping. Even after Sterling disappointed me, some part of me kept believing responsibility would arrive with age. It never did. "You're certain?" my attorney asked. "Completely. I established an irrevocable charitable trust and transferred the proceeds from the Briarwood sale into it, along with the portion of my remaining estate I had once intended Sterling to inherit. The beneficiary wasn't another relative. It was the city's children's hospital. I'd spent too many years using money to protect one grown man from consequences. I wanted what remained of my work to help people who actually needed protection. I signed the final page and handed the pen back. There was no dramatic satisfaction, no celebration, just relief. Sterling would leave prison one day, but there would be no mansion waiting for him, no inheritance capable of rebuilding the illusion he'd destroyed. Whatever life he created afterward would have to be built with his own hands. Amberly would face the consequences of her own financial choices as well. For the first time, neither of them would be able to treat my bank account as an emergency exit. A month later, I left the city and moved into a small cabin in the mountains. It wasn't impressive. 2 bedrooms, an old stone fireplace, a porch facing a line of pine trees. I owned nicer places, but none had ever felt quieter. One morning, I sat outside drinking coffee and realized the bruise on my chest had completely disappeared. I touched the place where Sterling's finger had struck me 13 times. There was nothing there anymore. The memory remained, but the pain didn't. That distinction mattered. I had spent years believing patience meant continuing to give someone another chance. Now I understood patience also meant knowing when enough chances had already been given. I didn't defeat my son. Sterling defeated himself one decision at a time. I simply stopped standing between him and the consequences. I didn't take his house. He had never owned it. I didn't empty his bank account. I stopped filling the gaps. I didn't put him in prison. He chose to force his way into my cabin carrying brass knuckles, and I didn't steal his inheritance. I decided where the money I'd earned would do the most good. Sometimes family will tell you that setting a boundary is cruelty because they benefited from you having none. Don't confuse the two. Love can help someone stand. It should not spend a lifetime carrying someone who refuses to use their own legs. Sterling once stood in my backyard, jabbed me 13 times and told me, "You're nothing without my money." In the end, he learned the truth in the hardest possible way. It had never been his money, and my worth had never depended on whether my son understood it. I looked across the mountains, listened to the wind moving through the pines, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because I had taken revenge, but because I had finally stopped paying the price for someone else's choices.